As papers are being distributed, I'm wondering if we have a volunteer who would lead us in a word of prayer to help get us started. Trish, you're a beautiful prayer. Would you be comfortable in praying for us? Come stand right here and I'll hold the mic over where everybody can hear you.
Okay. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence here and for allowing us to live in that presence, to share it with others, to absorb all of that goodness into our lives, to be patient, to be kind, to be loving, to be charitable, to be understanding, to dig into the truth, to share that truth with others. Thank you for our fellowship and for Marc's leadership. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, if you were absent last week and still do not have the basic historical outline, we've sent for Darla Rosebrook, who's going to print some more, and we'll get those in here and have a second round of those who weren't here so that we can get that to you. I will not read and work through all of that. That is a self-study document. You can keep up with things, because as we move through today, I'm going to jump ahead on the American history side and then drop back and go into how the Methodist expression followed along with the United States development. There are two key words that I want you to remember today. And I did not want to have to pin John Moran to a third entire hour in here. He was great last week. So just remember these. Number one is connectional. Say that with me. Number two is prevenient. Does anybody know what those words mean? Prevenient is a uniquely Wesleyan term that has caught on. Okay, here's Linda with the additional copies for those who were not here last week. Hands on those. They're scattered everywhere, Linda. And kudos to Darla Rosebrook. I was teasing her last week when you all got on to me about the font size. I thought she was in here and she wasn't. And then it looked like I had thrown her under the bus by shifting the blame to her, and I never like to do that because Darla is worth her weight in gold. She's wonderful. So if you don't like the font size, get yourself a magnifying glass, all right? Or go online and run you a bigger print copy of it at umc.org. That's where you're going to get all the fill-in-the-gap material that I don't have time to go into. Everything you wanted to know and a lot of stuff you really wish you didn't know about the Methodist Church is at umc.org. Back to the two terms. Prevenient, we're going to understand where it came from today as we talk about John Wesley, but that's the expression of grace that's out in front of us. That's the grace that's working on our behalf, opening doors. It's not predestinationism. It's just a grace that is the zone of God's plan for our life. And if we're smart enough and grace-filled enough, we'll catch on and follow it. Connectional describes the interconnectedness of our nation. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's in the Pledge of Allegiance. We're one nation, but we are divided into many groups. But we are connected together, not only in spirit, but by the order of government that we share in. We're a connectional nation, a connectional democracy. As a United Methodist denomination, we are a connectional church. We're divided up into many congregations and annual conferences, but we also share the same spirit of representative government, and we'll understand how that comes about today. When we left last week, we had talked about John Wesley and his Holy Club and the call of ministry upon his life that had been placed there by his father. But after the parsonage was set on fire and the rebellion against the Anglican Church was so intense, Wesley declined. but he just couldn't outgrow that prevenient tug. This is where the term prevenient has its roots. Wesley just kept feeling that tug. Remember last week he was also stuck in his head. Smart as a whip, OCD, very organized. The word Methodist was coined by others who were watching this holy club that expanded into multiple holy clubs that formed what was called the societies. These societies weren't necessarily churches per se, but they were groups of well-intended, well-doers, studiers of the faith, and those who were not afraid to get their hands dirty in doing things. So when we left last week, we talked about the parallel of what was going on historically. There were many people seeking a new life based on issues that had occurred in Europe and in England. Some of them had committed crimes. Some of them had colored outside the lines and were making mistakes. And they were looking for a fresh start in a new virgin land, so to speak, which was the New World. Others hadn't done anything wrong at all. They were just ready for a change of scenery. The government and religion had become intertwined. The church, the Anglican Church, had set the pace with intrusion. The church was heavy-handed, and there was a reluctance toward that. People were being taught how to act, how to think, and how to behave. And they were seeking the opportunity not to be told how to think or what to think, but how to think. To learn how to use the brain God had given them. I think I didn't say that right. They were being told what to do and how to behave, and they wanted to have some say in that. Not as an excuse to be radical and immoral or corrupt, but not to have everything legislated upon them. To have a part in the decision-making process, to have some democracy in their faith, so to speak. And so you can follow your two-column chart that you have and see the dates and the key names. And so under a spirit, thank you, Darla, and I bragged on you a minute ago to atone for last week. And you can ask Randy to be my witness. Last call for those who did not get a copy of last week's stuff. The New World is developing, and it's under the spirit of an English oversight. The authorities in England are seeing the colonization of the New World as an expansion of the English nation. And you know your American history. What happens as people successfully make it to the New World? What are the groups called as they group together? The colonies, right. It was a colonization process. And remember, it was no easy journey to get across that big Atlantic Ocean. You can imagine Christopher Columbus and those early explorers and the vessels that they have. Think of the cruise ships we have nowadays and the ocean liners that used to precede jet air travel overseas, and the Titanic. And even these cruise ships, they're bigger than skyscrapers in downtown cities. They're huge. We're talking about people making a tempestuous trek back and forth across the Atlantic without the weather tracking systems, without the safety of these modern vessels. Nothing really moves high speed at sea, but we can move certainly a lot faster than they did when they were dependent upon the wind. And so it was a tempestuous journey, and it took a long time to get here. And there was a sense of investment in the New World just by all it took to make the decision and make it across. Well, as the colonies developed, Wesley and the English roots back in Europe were taking a fascinating interest in all of this, and they wanted to be a part of what was going on. And so Wesley dispatched certain missionaries to come overseas as an extension of the societies which were rapidly and unofficially becoming what would be a Protestant denomination. But Wesley wanted to keep a close thumb on all the activities that were going on in the colonization process. There was the need to have worship. And so worship in a Methodist society was led by what was called a circuit rider, because there were more locations than there were missionaries for everybody to have a parish priest or pastor to bring the word every week. So these circuit riders would travel around on horseback, and some people were privileged to have a Sunday morning worship. Others got a Sunday afternoon experience. Some didn't get the circuit rider until evening time, as they say in the country. Some cases, they had to wait till midweek. But Wesley made sure that only those he sanctioned had the authority to preside in the circuit rider mindset. Later on, we're going to talk about the current United Methodist itineracy. Itinerate is a word that means what? Travel through, move about. You've always heard it said, I'm afraid to go to the Methodist church because as soon as I get settled in, they're going to move the preacher. And we'll talk about how that trait has its roots in this circuit riding history. Jumping back to the American side again, as the colonies began to develop, there were two dynamics that were going on. Number one, the same independent spirit that motivated people to make that tempestuous stretch across the Atlantic to the New World were feeling a sense of freedom and independence in their newfound virgin lands. And there was a growing spirit of resentment at England trying to control the endeavors, because that's part of their motive in fleeing to begin with. And there was a resistance toward that. And that resistance began to grow and be contagious, and at one point it boiled over at an event that is listed on your list called the Boston Tea Party. Anybody remember that? Anybody like tea? They say it's good for you. I'm brewing green tea along with my tea. It's supposed to be good for strokes and stuff. Well, what was the Boston Tea Party about? Taxation without representation. Why were they feeling that way? Europe sent their taxing formula over here and collected all the money, but nobody felt like they had any say in this because they were living outside of the Union, and they didn't like that. If they were going to have a taxing authority, and most societies need a taxing authority, that can be debated, I know, but that'll be a conversation for another day. They wanted to have say-so in it. And so the Boston Tea Party was a rebellion and sort of a declaration of independence. And speaking of that, there was a Declaration of Independence. Tell me about that. What did that accomplish? It separated the New World from English control. Okay? Now, as this independence occurred, take a look at the handout that looks like this. And we see an order of government that develops, and that is the right-hand column. The colonies turn into municipalities and or townships. And they begin to elect representatives to represent them in a governmental level on the municipal level. Nowadays, the modern terminology would be city council, your mayor, your civic agencies, and things like that. As the municipalities developed, they were grouped into counties and or parishes. Anybody ever lived in Louisiana? You have? Don't have counties there, do you? You have a parish, right? Is there any other state that has a parish? Okay. Parish is used in our United Methodist language, which we'll talk about here down the road. So the county level becomes another grouping of municipalities, and then you begin to develop states, okay? Colonies into states, and representatives from the townships and the counties have begun to serve on a state level. How many of you can name your state legislators? Good for you. We need to be more familiar with that. I stand in guilt. I'm incomplete on that. And then from the state level, you develop a national level of government. And all of the states elect representatives to serve on the national level. And the national government is divided into three branches, which you see there in parentheses. You have a legislative branch. Describe that for me. The congressional branch, that's the congressional chamber and the Senate. Okay? Jan Giroux has a brother who's been a congressman for now how many years?
Not anymore.
He's not, okay, he did retire. But how many years did Representative Barton do? 35 years. Remarkable career. Then you have the executive branch. That's the president, okay? And there's always a tug of war between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and that has been played out as clearly in the last couple of years as probably at any point in history. And then you have a third branch of government. What is that? The judicial branch, and that is the Supreme Court. Now, you have a court system that is a part of this that is not identified on your sheet, that is a part of every level of this. You have municipal courts. If you get a traffic ticket or speeding or running a red light, you might wind up going to the municipal court, or at least reporting to the municipal court with your plea of innocence or guilt or defensive driving, whatever it may be. There's the county court. There's the state court. And all levels of appeals and what have you on the national level until you get to the Supreme Court. And certain issues of great controversy and importance make their way to the Supreme Court. And once that decision is made, it's not going to change again unless the court decides to revisit or reconvene on a particular issue. All right, now let's go backwards again. Back to the Methodist societies that are emerging in the New World. Wesley is in charge of sanctioning these missionaries to serve, and there is tension between the colonies and the old world, or England, that is not just on a governmental basis but on a religious basis as well. And the people who are being asked to give offerings in their worship experiences are wondering where their money's going and who makes the decisions as to how it is saved, spent, or distributed. And why are we being starved to death as we grow and people are excited about this society and its theology of a gratitude-based righteousness? Why can't we have some say not only in where the money goes, but can't we ordain our own leaders? Because we're growing faster than Wesley is able to keep up with. Now let's digress for a minute. Before it reaches this pinnacle of tension, Wesley's own contagious excitement about what's going on, who he's sending overseas, what he's hearing from them, causes him to want to make a trip to the New World and experience himself. And you will see in the left-hand column of the two-column sheet where Wesley comes over here to be a missionary, so to speak, to a group of Indians in what we would now call Georgia. which is further south than the original colonies were. Wesley's endeavor overseas didn't go over real well. He was found to be a little bit arrogant because of his intellectual and OCD qualities. He was also found to be unable to catch the spirit, the heart side of the Indian people. To make matters worse, you have this contagious resistance toward English control, and to really ice the cupcake, he has a crush on one of the young Indian women, which did not go over well with the hierarchical structure of the Indian community. And before Wesley gets his head scalped or something like that, he gets the prevenient call that it's time to get the hell out and get back to England, so to speak. And he has to do so quickly, and he hitches a ride on a cargo boat back to England that is crewed by a large group of Moravians. Now, last week, Ronnie Kirby, who's back here in the back, stay away from him, all right? He's a smart cookie. He is a whole lot smarter than I am. He's very well read, and if it gets any worse, I'm just going to defer all the questions straight to him. And I'm just teasing him. He's a wonderful guy. We're just so glad that he and Diana are visiting our church. They're neighbors to us. He brought to my attention last week that the Wesleys, especially John Wesley's dad, Samuel, had been influenced by the Eastern Orthodox Church. In fact, he brought me a multi-page handout that has a lot of information on that. If you're interested in reading about that, talk to Ronnie, and he'll be glad, I'm sure, to give you the link so that you can read that influence. And there was indeed some influence there, as there had been in several other faith expressions, both Catholic and Protestant. But on the boat back to England, Wesley encounters these Moravians. And Wesley's going back feeling a sense of defeat, a sense of disappointment, a sense of concern, a sense of uncertainty. And these Moravians, they're having a great time. This sailing endeavor is work. It's an enterprise. It's a vocation. But they've got their accordions and their tambourines and their instrumentations. And every day there is this emotional, Pentecostal, flamboyant expression of worship that featured a sense of joy about life and of knowing God that was so incredibly intriguing to Wesley and brought to a head this struggle that Wesley's obsessive-compulsive nature and his rich gifts in intellectualism could not bring about the heartfelt joy that these Moravians had. And Wesley was truly in a sense of turmoil because he could not manufacture those feelings. And his one-dimensional style was impeding the growth of the faith expression. Well, all of this changed. And last week I gave Jean Tracer credit and bragged to you about her son-in-law, and I had a good conversation on the phone this week with her son-in-law. So I'm just going to call on Jean. Tell us what happened for Wesley to experience a transformation in this struggle. Exactly. In case you couldn't hear Jean, she's a surviving spouse of one of our great annual conference United Methodist ministers, Eldon Tracer. Wesley, in the midst of this struggle, went to worship in an Anglican setting at a place called Aldersgate. Now, we had an Aldersgate United Methodist Church at the Crabtrees, and who else? Yes, Mary. You were there? I didn't realize that, George. You were at Aldersgate? Okay. I wasn't born yet then. Did I see the Fowlers' hands up? Anyway, I saw several hands who were Aldersgate people. Sadly, it's closed, but Aldersgate is a big name in Methodism because in the midst of that worship, Wesley was hearing the epistle to the Romans being read. Now, I got to tell you what's amazing about this. You talk about prevenient grace that has led Wesley to this moment. If you think I'm boring on Sunday, you go back and have the epistle to the Romans read at Aldersgate in that Anglican setting and whatever date is on your sheet. They're just reading, and it's passionless, and it is long, and a lot of people don't understand it. It's in the midst of this, looking at your watch in the back door, that Wesley finally feels the power of the Holy Spirit, validating him, securing him, encouraging him, as the creed says, guidance, comfort, and strength. And all of a sudden, Wesley is able to find some balance between head and heart. Have you noticed that's still a challenge for Methodism even today? Even for our congregation. But Wesley found that. And when he experienced that, as Gene described, that transformation led to a bright new chapter. Now, before we have a happy ending in all of this, going back to the Boston Tea Party, there was a similar movement and sentiment in the American societies that led to an event, and I think the date is 1730. I'm not sure what it was. That's not the right date. It's on your sheet, and I don't have that sheet. I've given them all away. But a group of the American leaders decided to have their own Boston Tea Party, so to speak. And they designed it at a time when nobody would catch on back in the old country as to what was going on. It was kind of a surprise event. And what better day to have a surprise than on Christmas Day when no one is thinking about church politics. Don't ever underestimate the underhanded quality of politicians. All right? So the Christmas conference, somebody find that on your sheet and tell me what the date was. And holler it out whenever you find it. 1784, yes, thank you, Carl. They had this Christmas conference where they got together, thank you, Linda, and had their own, I can't see it because the font's too small. They had their Christmas conference and they declared their own independence, and in this, the American missionaries, many of whom are listed on this sheet, they began to ordain their own people so that they have enough people to lead the growing church. Now, this schism is going to heal over a period of time, and harmony is going to return. And the societies are going to be actually turning into a denominational expression known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. Later on, there is a Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was a branch and a product of the slave and human rights and civil rights struggle of years later. Oddly enough, Methodism has its roots in equality of all people, because the history of the sentiment of people wanting to come overseas, many of these people were not the affluent of the English culture. Many of them had made mistakes. Many of them had served imprisonment time. The Wesleyan expression reached the have-nots. It reached many blue-collar people as well as intellectuals. And if you noticed, Wesley in 1758, while he had been over here, baptized 2 African-American slaves, breaking the color barrier for the Methodist societies. Sadly, certain entities in the South, just as so culturally, did not capture this spirit and still struggle with it today. But now that the Methodist Episcopal Church is organizing, go back to the 2-column sheet And here you will see how the roots of American democracy influence the connectional church developing that we know today. Just as you have municipalities and townships in the right column, you have local churches. All right? The city of Arlington has a whole bunch of local churches. That's what I referred to in the sermon this morning in the attendance comparison, starting with Aldersgate, which is the only church north of I-30, not Aldersgate, New World. And then dropping down, you have Good Shepherd and First Arlington that are up off Randall Mill and First Arlington on Center Street. You had Aldersgate before it closed. You have Covenant. You have Good Shepherd. You have St. Andrews. You have St. Barnabas over here. You have Trinity, which I missed. And St. John the Apostle. We're about as far south as you can go. These are local churches. And we have our own administrative body. That's the other handout you got today that folds over. We don't need to spend time on that, but that's exemplary of the volunteers that are elected by the church to serve at a variety of levels with congregational governance. If you look on your handouts, you'll see a staff parish relations committee. That's our personnel committee. The employee handbook, the hiring, the oversight, the salaries of all of our personnel are all handled through the Staff Parish Relations Committee. Preachers are not hired, they're assigned, and we'll talk about that in the history of the circuit rider in a minute today if we have time. If not, we'll start there next week. The finance team, Ministry Team for Stewardship Finance, they oversee our budget, raising the budget, stewarding the budget, paying the bills, keeping things in balance, saving money for the future, all of that sort of stuff. The trustees maintain the property, the parsonage I live in, the building and grounds that are here, insurance policies, the church endowment handled by both the finance team and the board of trustees. Lay leadership is the group that determines who these people are going to be, and you invite people to serve for rotating periods. Anybody is eligible to serve in the various levels. Obviously, some people are better at some things than others. We are grouped in a large group of churches in a district known as the Fort Worth East District. It starts way up at White's Chapel, which is on the border of our annual conference, and drops all the way down below Waxahachie to the Red Oak and Corsicana areas. The dividing line is Highway 377 north of I-30, I-35W south of I-30. So it's a large group. There's, I don't remember how many churches are in the district. Doug, do you remember offhand? Is it 60? Some odd. It's a lot of churches, and we have a district superintendent. There are 5 districts in the annual conference. And you can see how it relates to the government side. Local church with municipalities, the district would be equal to the counties. The annual conference, that's equivalent to our states. And just as the states elect representatives to the national government, each annual conference elects representatives to go to our general conference. The general conference used to be the national level. Now it's become the world level. And that has brought about many complexities, which we'll talk about later, or if we're lucky, we won't even get to it. The General Conference, I'm just teasing you on that, of course. The Jurisdictional Conference has a subgroup known as the Jurisdictional Conference. The Jurisdictional Conference exists solely for the purpose of the election and appointment of our bishops. All right, my mic's back on again. Now, you can see the General Conference equals the legislative branch. The Jurisdictional Conference equals the executive branch. And then you have a Judicial Council that equals the judicial branch of government. Our Judicial Council exists to solve the major squabbles that can't get worked out. if I, as a clergy person, file a complaint or a charge against Doug Crabtree for coming forward in the communion line as he did today, telling me I look like game show host Bill Cullen from 1960 when I have my glasses on, and we can't solve that squabble at the annual conference level, or a decision is made, no doubt, in Doug Crabtree's favor that I don't like, and I keep pursuing it, and we keep arguing and keep bickering about it, it will wind up at the Judicial Council until the Judicial Council makes a ruling. Now, what's important about this right now is we've just had a very controversial General Conference session where a very politically motivated effort has chosen a certain plan by which the denomination is to move forward. It only represents a third or less than that of the American influence. But the overseas influence, which some say included a lot of under-the-table issues, swayed the vote from primitive cultures where certain leaders might be polygamous and where homosexuality might be a crime or a chargeable offense, took the vote. The other side is claiming that dimensions of this are unconstitutional, and it has quickly gone to the Judicial Council. Doug Crabtree, who's a precious friend and as fine a Methodist layman as I've ever known or had at any level, if I didn't love him, I wouldn't tease him, sent me a text as recently yesterday that gives the date of this Judicial Council meeting, which is coming up right after Easter. We've got one more Easter together, folks, I think. And I'm just teasing you, because they're going to make some rulings on how constitutional or unconstitutional this General Conference decision was. And if they strike much of it down, this Wesleyan Covenant Association, which has been a well-organized splinter group, is going to go ahead and take their toys and leave. And we're going to have an amenable or maybe a little more pro-wrestling oriented denominational split. If it's upheld, the majority on the American side are gearing up for the General Conference that meets next year for a possible secession of those of us who, of course, are in the right. And I'm saying that playfully. That's probably too tense an issue for me to have fun about, but I'm just in a good mood today and having fun, and I'm very confident that we're going to be fine when we come through all of this. So that's how this representative government works. So today as we close, you've heard prevenient grace, the grace that walks in front of us that Wesley experienced, that he has shared as a theological doctrine which other faith expressions have caught on to, that life is not all accidents. God really is out there wooing us and leading us and inviting us and encouraging us to follow his paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I heard that in the Bible one time. We've also heard the connectional nature of our church, and that piggybacks on last week's stuff about a gratitude-based righteousness and all the aspects of democracy. And so I hope today you've not only got a little more history, but you now have a frame of reference to how our connectional church operates. We're a democracy formed just like the United States, at the same time, in the same ways, and the same blessings and the same challenges are present in our denomination as they are with our nation. All right, I'll take just a couple of quick questions because we're almost out of time. Does anybody have anything you want to ask about? Anything that I messed up on? Anything that I omitted that you think is important? Anything for the good of the order?
You said there were three connectional prevenient. Was there a third one? Did I totally miss the third one?
Was there a third one? Did you write it down? Show me what it might have been.
That's why I'm trying to ask you what the third one was.
I think it was Crabtree.
No. What? Sanctifying grace. Is that it?
No.
I don't know. You got sidetracked.
Huh? I said 3 and gave you 2?
Yeah.
You should pray for that in the next sermon. Sanctifying grace. Well, I mean, all Christian denominations have that. You know what that is. That's the purification as we grow into better versions of ourselves. Any other question today?
Doug Crabtree suggested we have a vote as to whether or not you look like Bill Cullen.
Now, do you think that in the midst of this, Doug Crabtree would whisper under his breath to his wife and his friend Doug Smith and come up with such a ludicrous proposition? Everybody in here knows I look like Channing Tatum and not Bill Cullen. So that's already resolved. Gene, thank you for your help. Yes, sir. Dr. Hudson.
What happened to Methodism in England over the last couple of hundred years?
Well, they did well for a while, and then all of Christianity in Europe really changed and declined. And it's even a taxable entity now. The way I understand it, you declare whether or not you want to be a church member or not. And if you are, you don't have a stewardship campaign in your church to support the budget, your taxes go up, and the government then supports the church. And very few people attend worship, and you can go into these marvelous cathedrals that are apart, whether it's Methodist or anything else, and there might be 40 people in a 900 or 1,500 seat building. Some of them have turned into nightclubs, museums, bars, social occasions, and that's what historians are saying is the same trend has begun to happen in our country. That's the way it's going to be here in another 50 to 60 years. I hope they're wrong. But that's a very shallow answer, and there'll be better results to that online, David, but thank you for asking. All right, we got to worship again. Blessings to you. We'll continue and move forward. We got a lot to do. We'll talk about the circuit rider, the itineracy, Wesleyan approach to Scripture, a whole lot of beliefs. I've got more handouts, so we're going to run at least 2 more Sundays, which is Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. The one after that is negotiable. All right, blessings.